On the night of August the 29th, 1992, more than 78,000 people packed themselves into Wembley Stadium in London, England, and roared until the old concrete shook. They had come to see two men who happened to be family. Two brothers-in-law, one Canadian, one English, wrestling for a championship in front of the biggest crowd of both their lives. And what they witnessed that night has been called, by the very company that produced it, the greatest match in the history of SummerSlam. But here is what those 78,000 people did not know as they screamed themselves hoarse. They did not know that one of the two men in that ring had spent the night before his flight to England smoking crack until dawn. They did not know that he had failed a substance test just weeks earlier and was already a marked man inside his own company. They did not know that he would forget nearly everything he was supposed to do out there, and that the other man, the one he was fighting, would have to secretly walk him through the greatest match of both their careers, move by move, whispering instructions with his lips pressed against a sweaty ear so the cameras would never catch it. They saw a celebration. What they were actually looking at, if you understand what was happening beneath the surface, was closer to a funeral procession that had not started yet. A stadium full of people cheering for men who were literally running out of time. The bright lights, the Union Jack, the fireworks bursting over the London sky. It was all real, and it was all covering something that no promoter would ever put on a poster. In this video, we pull back the curtain on SummerSlam 1992, the event that looked like the top of the mountain but was actually built over a grave. We are going to tell you the truth about what was really happening backstage, inside the bodies, and behind the smiles of the men who gave the fans the night of their lives. Because the greatest match in SummerSlam history is also one of the darkest stories in wrestling. And by the time we reach the end, you will understand why so many of the men who stood in that stadium never got to grow old. But to understand how dark that night really was, you first have to understand how it almost never happened at all. The year 1992 should have been a victory lap for the World Wrestling Federation. Just a few years earlier, Vince McMahon had conquered the wrestling world. He had taken his father's regional promotion, gone national, crushed the old territories, put wrestling on national television and pay-per-view, and turned Hulk Hogan into a household name recognized by children who had never watched a single match. The company was a juggernaut. It was the biggest wrestling promotion the planet had ever seen, and then it all started to come apart. The trouble had been building for years, hidden underneath the muscles and the spandex and the cartoon characters, anabolic substances. They were everywhere in professional wrestling in the 1980s. The look that made stars, the impossibly huge vascular superhero physiques that sold tickets and action figures, was in large part a chemical creation. The bigger you were, the more money you made. And so the men of that era pushed their bodies to sizes that nature never intended, injecting themselves with substances that added slabs of muscle while quietly poisoning their hearts, their livers, and their minds. For a long time, nobody talked about it. It was just part of the business. The unspoken cost of being a star. A young wrestler would come into the locker room, look around at the mountains of muscle surrounding him, and understand very quickly that if he wanted to eat, if he wanted to get pushed, if he wanted his shot at the big money and the bright lights, he had a choice to make, and most of them made the same one. They looked at the men who were succeeding, saw exactly how those men were built, and did whatever it took to build themselves the same way. The problem is that the human heart was never designed to sit inside a body inflated to those dimensions. Anabolic substances thicken the walls of the heart. They warp cholesterol. They put a strain on the cardiovascular system that compounds year after year, silent and invisible until one day it simply stops. The men of that era were, without fully understanding it, trading their futures for their physiques, trading decades off the back end of their lives for a few more years in the spotlight. And nobody in a position of power had any real incentive to make them stop. The bigger they got, the more money everybody made. But in 1991, a doctor named George Zahorian went on trial. Zahorian was a Pennsylvania physician who had for years served as the ringside doctor at World Wrestling Federation events, and who had also been functioning as something much darker. a pharmacy on legs, a man who distributed substances and other drugs to wrestlers as casually as handing out aspirin. He had sold to some of the biggest names in the company. He was so brazen about it that he would reportedly take orders and make deliveries at the arenas themselves, treating the locker room like a pharmacy counter. When Zahorian was convicted of illegally distributing substances, the fallout landed directly on the doorstep of the World Wrestling Federation and on Vince McMahon himself. And by 1992, the federal government was circling. McMahon was under investigation. There were whispers growing louder every week that the head of the biggest wrestling company in the world might be indicted, might be charged with conspiracy to distribute substances to his own performers, and might even go to prison. The company was hemorrhaging money and momentum. Business in the United States was down. The Hulk Hogan era was ending, and there was no clear replacement. The whole empire was wobbling. And in the middle of all that chaos, McMahon made a decision that seemed almost insane. He decided to take his biggest summer show out of the United States entirely, to roll the dice on foreign soil, to stake the reputation of his flagship summer event on a country where American wrestling had never before held a stadium show of this size. He chose England, he chose Wembley. It was a gamble born partly of desperation. Business was strong overseas, even as it sagged at home, and Wembley Stadium was one of the most famous venues on earth. If McMahon could fill it, if he could put 80,000 people in the seats, it would be a statement to the world that the World Wrestling Federation was still king, no matter what the newspapers were writing about substances and grand juries. And Wembley was not just any building, it was hallowed ground. The twin towers of the old stadium were as recognizable to the British public as any landmark in the country. It was the home of English football, the site of legendary sporting moments, a venue soaked in national pride. To bring American professional wrestling into that cathedral and fill it to the rafters would be an achievement that no wrestling promoter had ever managed on that scale. It would be the kind of image that could paper over 100 bad headlines back home, a sea of humanity, waving flags under an open English sky, all there for his product. But a stadium of that size is also a terrifying thing to try to fill. Wembley did not seat a few thousand like the arenas the World Wrestling Federation ran night after night in America. It swallowed crowds. Rows and rows and rows of empty seats would be a humiliation broadcast to the world, proof that the doubters were right, that the empire really was crumbling. There was no hiding in a building that big. You either filled it or you exposed yourself. McMahon was betting the prestige of his entire summer on being able to fill one of the biggest venues on the planet in a foreign country in the middle of the worst scandal his company had ever faced. But to fill Wembley, he needed a main event that the British public would crawl over broken glass to see. He needed a hero the English could call their own, and that is where the British Bulldog comes in. Davey Boy Smith was born in Goulburn in Lancashire, England in 1962. He had started wrestling as a teenager, a compact, powerfully built kid with a natural gift for the physical side of the business. He made his television debut at just 15 years old. Alongside his cousin, Tom Billington, who wrestled as the Dynamite Kid, he formed one half of the British Bulldogs, one of the most exciting and influential tag teams of the 1980s. Their matches were fast, hard-hitting, and years ahead of their time. They were beloved, but the British Bulldogs were also a cautionary tale in the making. The Dynamite Kid, in particular, was a man who abused his body without mercy, packing enormous muscle onto a small frame through relentless substance use, and paying for it with injuries that would eventually leave him confined to a wheelchair. Dynamite was, in the eyes of many who saw him work, one of the most gifted wrestlers who ever lived. He could do things in the ring that men twice his size could not dream of, and he destroyed himself doing them, chasing a look and a style that his body could not sustain, until by the end of his life he could barely walk. That was the cousin Davey Boy Smith came up under. That was the example he watched day after day on the road and in the gym. The two of them pushed each other, spurred each other on, matched each other injection for injection and injury for injury. Davey worshipped the toughness and the intensity that the business demanded, and he learned to treat his own body the way the men around him treated theirs. Which is to say, as a thing to be used up in the pursuit of greatness, consequences be damned. By the time he became a single star, Davey Boy Smith looked like a Greek statue carved out of granite. He was thick and powerful and cut from top to bottom, one of the most impressively built men in a company full of them. And every inch of that impossible physique was a debt, a loan taken out against his own future, with interest that would come due far sooner than anyone imagined. Traveling those same roads as his cousin, absorbing those same lessons, he was learning the same dangerous habits that were already, by 1992, beginning to close in on him. By 1992, Davey Boy Smith had reinvented himself. He had left the tag team behind, trademarked the name British Bulldog for himself, and come back to the World Wrestling Federation as a singles star. He was draped in the Union Jack. He carried himself like a national hero, and in England, that is exactly what he was. When the World Wrestling Federation announced that SummerSlam would be at Wembley and that the British Bulldog would be in the main event challenging for a championship in front of his own countrymen, the tickets flew out the door, nearly 80,000 of them. The story wrote itself. The hometown boy, the son of England, coming home to win the biggest match of his life in front of the biggest crowd of his life. It was perfect. There was just one problem. The British Bulldog was falling apart. The first sign of trouble had come earlier that year, and it was a serious one. Davey Boy Smith failed a drug test. He tested positive for substances and was handed a suspension, a 6-week penalty that landed at the worst possible time, just as the company was trying to distance itself from the entire substance scandal. Bret Hart, who was the one pushing behind the scenes for Davey to get the championship, later recalled ringing his brother-in-law to share some good news about the match, only to find him crushed and demoralized by the suspension, barely able to muster any enthusiasm at all. Think about the position the company was in. Vince McMahon was under federal investigation for substances, and the man he had chosen to headline his biggest show of the year, the hero he was going to build Wembley around, had just tested positive for the very drugs that were threatening to send McMahon to prison. It was a contradiction sitting right at the heart of the whole enterprise. But the suspension was the least of it, because as the summer wore on and SummerSlam approached, Davey Boy Smith's problems went far beyond a failed test. He was using cocaine, he was abusing painkillers, and the man who was supposed to be the picture of British strength and heroism was, behind closed doors, a person in the grip of addiction, coming apart at the seams while an entire nation prepared to celebrate him. The most chilling detail of all comes from Bret Hart himself, who told the story in his autobiography years later. In the hours before Davey was due to fly to England for the biggest match of his life, Bret was frantically trying to reach him by phone. He kept calling Florida, where Davey was living, and kept being told that Davey was out. Finally, Bret managed to track down Jim, another wrestler and family member, the man known as the Anvil, who had been with Davey. And what Jim told him was terrifying. According to Bret, Jim said that he had just dropped Davey and Diana at the airport, and that Davey had been high as a kite when he boarded the plane because he had been up all night smoking crack cocaine. Jim said Davey had a gorilla on his back, that he was genuinely worried about him. Let that sink in for a moment. The hero of Wembley, the man about to walk into a stadium filled with 80,000 adoring fans, the man whose face was on the posters, boarded his flight to the biggest night of his career without having slept, with crack cocaine still moving through his system, his body already beginning the long process of destroying itself. And this is the man Bret Hart was going to have to wrestle for 25 minutes in front of the entire world. Which brings us to the match itself, and to a secret that stayed hidden from the fans for years. Bret Hart was, by universal agreement, one of the greatest technical wrestlers who ever lived. He prided himself on his craft, on his ability to construct a match like an architect, building it piece by piece into something that would send a crowd home happy. And he had spent months planning this one. He had thought about it constantly, piecing it together move by move in his mind, saving up a brilliant finish he had learned years earlier for exactly this occasion. This was going to be his masterpiece. But a masterpiece requires two artists, and when Bret got to Wembley, he discovered that his partner was in no condition to paint. Davey Boy Smith was exhausted, out of shape from his time away, and by many accounts still feeling the effects of everything he had put into his body. Worse, he had not properly prepared. He had not committed the match to memory the way a performer of that magnitude needed to. And when the bell rang and the two men locked up in front of that roaring ocean of people, it became horrifyingly clear to Bret that Davey had forgotten almost the entire match. Now imagine that pressure. You are standing in the middle of Wembley Stadium. Nearly 80,000 people are screaming. This is being beamed to homes across the world. On pay-per-view, it is the main event. And your opponent, the man you are supposed to be trading this delicate, complicated dance with, has essentially gone blank. He does not remember what comes next. He is running on instinct and adrenaline and very little else. A lesser wrestler would have panicked. The match would have fallen apart. It would have been a disaster in front of the largest audience of both their lives. Instead, Bret Hart did something that stands as one of the most remarkable feats of in-ring generalship in wrestling history. He took control. Quietly, invisibly, he began to lead Davey through the entire match in real time. He called the moves in whispers, telling Davey what to do next, where to go, when to reverse, when to rest. He improvised around Davey's exhaustion when Davey got blown up, gasping for air far too early in a match that was supposed to last nearly half an hour. Bret slowed things down, guided them into rest holds, and bought his brother-in-law time to recover, all while making it look intentional, dramatic part of the story. At one point, the strain became so obvious that the referee, Joey Marella, could see something was wrong. But the fans never knew. From the seats, from the couches at home, it looked like two evenly matched warriors pushing each other to the absolute limit. Nobody watching had the faintest idea that one of those warriors was being carried, note for note, by the other. There were other layers to the illusion that night, too. In Davey's corner stood a young boxer named Lennox Lewis, draped in patriotic colors, lending the Bulldog an air of national champion legitimacy. Lewis would go on to become one of the greatest heavyweight boxers of all time, the undisputed champion of the world. But on this night, he was a prop in Davey's story, another brushstroke in the portrait of the invincible English hero. The entire presentation was engineered to make Davey Boy Smith look like a conquering son of Britain, and it worked so well and looked so convincing, precisely because Bret Hart was doing the invisible work of holding the whole thing together from the inside. And there is a particular kind of genius in what Bret accomplished that has to be understood to be appreciated. Anybody can execute a match when both men know it cold and both men are fresh. The true test of a wrestler's mind is what happens when everything goes wrong, when your partner is lost and gassed and the biggest crowd of your life is watching, and you have to invent your way to safety without anyone noticing the wheels coming off. Bret did not just survive that, he built a masterpiece out of it. He read Davey's exhaustion like a musician reading a room and adjusted the tempo of the entire performance to keep his brother-in-law upright. Every time it seemed like the match might collapse, Bret found a way to make the collapse itself look like drama. That is not wrestling. That is something closer to sorcery. And the finish came exactly as Bret had planned it. That old finish he had tucked away in his memory for years, a piece of business he had learned from the veteran Leo Burke and saved for the perfect moment. Davey Boy Smith reversing a sunset flip, sitting down and pinning the shoulders of the hitman to the mat as the referee counted to 3. The stadium detonated, Rule Britannia blared over the speakers, fireworks exploded above the ring. The British Bulldog had done it. He had won the Intercontinental Championship in his home country in front of the largest crowd of his life. Davey's wife Diana, who was also Bret's sister, climbed into the ring, caught between her husband and her brother, weeping. The two men, family in real life and rivals in the story, embraced. The image is beautiful. It is one of the most iconic moments in the history of the company. And it was, in the truest sense, a work of fiction. A gorgeous illusion built on top of an ugly reality. The hero was a sick man being propped up by his opponent. The triumph was a rescue operation, and the smile on Davey Boy Smith's face hid a body that was already dying. But the darkness of SummerSlam 1992 does not end with the main event, because when you look at the rest of that card, at the men who filled out that show, you start to see a pattern that is almost too grim to believe. Consider the other main event of the evening, the World Wrestling Federation Championship match, in which the Ultimate Warrior challenged the champion, Randy Savage. The Ultimate Warrior was one of the most explosive, most heavily merchandised, most physically spectacular performers the company had ever produced. His body was a comic book drawing come to life. Enormous, rippling, impossibly defined. Fans adored him. Children wanted to be him, and that body, that superhero physique, was maintained through years of heavy substance use. The Warrior wrestled his heart out that night against Savage in a match remembered for its drama and its wild ending, with Ric Flair and Mr. Perfect lurking at ringside and interfering to plant the seeds of future storylines. The two babyfaces did not fully trust each other, and the tension between them, combined with the outside interference, gave the match a chaotic, unpredictable energy. It was one of the last truly big nights of the Ultimate Warrior's World Wrestling Federation career. He would leave the company not long after, part of a turbulent, combustible relationship with McMahon that saw him walk out and come back and get released multiple times over the years, each departure more bitter than the last. But it is not the contract disputes that make his story dark. It is his body, the same body that had made him a phenomenon. And in April of 2014, the Ultimate Warrior collapsed in a hotel parking lot in Arizona while walking to his car with his wife. He was 54 years old. Just 3 days earlier, he had been inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. The day before he died, he had given a haunting, almost prophetic speech on live television about how every man's heart eventually beats its final beat. His death was caused by a heart attack, the result of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And the years of substance use that had built his legendary body are widely believed to have played a role in the failure of the heart inside it. Now look further down the card. The Undertaker faced Kamala, the massive face-painted monster, billed as a savage from the jungles of Uganda. Behind the terrifying gimmick was a gentleman named James Harris, a former Mississippi sharecropper and truck driver who, by all accounts, did not have a mean bone in his body outside the ring. In his later years, diabetes and high blood pressure ravaged his body. Both of his legs were amputated. He spent his final years in a wheelchair, relying on disability and the kindness of the wrestling community. He died in 2020 at the age of 70, his body worn down by decades of hard living and illness. The tag team champions that night were the Natural Disasters, a duo of super heavyweights. One half of that team was John Tenna, who performed as Earthquake, a former sumo wrestler of genuine agility for his enormous size. Tenta was diagnosed with cancer and died in 2006. He was only 42 years old, and hovering over the entire event, woven into the storyline of the championship main event, was Mr. Perfect Curt Hennig, one of the most gifted in-ring technicians the business ever saw, a man who could make anything look effortless. Curt Hennig died in a Florida hotel room in February of 2003. He was found by hotel staff. The cause of death was ruled an accidental overdose of cocaine. His father later confirmed that Curt had also been abusing painkillers and using substances. He was 44 years old. Do you see it yet? The pattern hiding underneath the fireworks? The Ultimate Warrior, Kamala, Earthquake, Mr. Perfect, the British Bulldog, some of the biggest names on that card, men who thrilled 80,000 people on one perfect summer night, would be dead decades before their time. Heart attacks, cancer, overdoses, bodies broken down by the very things that had made them stars. Substances, painkillers, cocaine, the brutal grind of the schedule with no off-season and no mercy, 300 nights a year on the road, sleeping in a different city every night, driving through the dark from one town to the next, medicating the pain of the travel and the pain of the bumps just to be able to do it all again the next day. And this is only counting the men whose fates are most directly tied to that lifestyle. The card that night was stacked deep with performers from wrestling's most dangerous generation, and if you traced every single name forward through the years, you would find far too many stories that ended too early. It is one of the grim rituals of following this business. You watch an old show from the golden era, a show full of joy and color and larger-than-life heroes, and then you look up how many of the men in it are still alive. And the answer is never as many as you hope. SummerSlam 1992 was not just a wrestling show. In hindsight, it looks almost like a gathering of the doomed, a snapshot of an entire generation of performers who were burning themselves alive to entertain us and who would pay the ultimate price for it. They did not know it, of course. on that night, they were gods, immortal, bulletproof, 20 and 30 years of life stretched out ahead of them, or so they believed, and the crowd believed it too. That is what made it so beautiful, and that is what makes it, looking back, so unbearably sad. But the darkest chapter of this story belongs once again to the man in the main event, to the British Bulldog. Because his win at Wembley, the greatest night of his professional life, turned out to be the beginning of a long and painful decline. Just months after headlining Wembley Stadium, after winning that championship, after being celebrated as a national hero, Davey Boy Smith was fired. The reason was tangled up in that same substance-related trial that had been threatening the entire company. As the federal case swirled and McMahon tried desperately to clean house and protect the business, Davey, with his failed test and his associations, became a liability. And so, almost unbelievably, the man who had just sold out Wembley and delivered what would later be called the greatest SummerSlam match ever was shown the door. The peak and the fall, separated by only a few short months. He would return. That was the pattern of Davey Boy Smith's career. He kept leaving and kept coming back, and the fans always welcomed him home. His popularity in his home country never faded, no matter how many times he was fired or how much trouble he found. There was something about him, the flag, the physique, the underdog charm, that the British public simply refused to give up on. When he returned in 1994, he was thrown straight into the main event scene, into the ongoing saga of the Hart family feuding and teaming with the very relatives he had stood beside at Wembley. He would even reinvent himself as a villain, a heel, which few had thought he could pull off, and he did it well enough to main event pay-per-views against world champions. On the surface, the career kept going. He was always employed, always over, always somewhere near the top of the card, but underneath, the man was deteriorating, because the drugs never let go. The gorilla on his back that the Anvil had described only grew heavier with every passing year, and then came the injury that may have sealed his fate. In WCW, a few years later, Davey suffered a horrific back injury when he landed hard on a trapdoor that had been built into the ring floor for another wrestler's dramatic entrance. His body slammed onto that hidden seam, and something in his back gave way. That injury caused him chronic, agonizing pain, the kind that does not go away, the kind that follows a man into every waking hour of his life. And to manage that pain, he leaned harder and harder on painkillers and morphine, deepening an addiction that was already destroying him. What had started as recreation and performance enhancement had become, by now, a genuine dependency, a medical crisis, a man swallowing handfuls of pills just to function. His marriage to Diana fell apart. They divorced. His personal life descended into chaos, marked by public accusations, estrangement, and heartbreak that spilled out into tell-all books and tabloid stories. The union between the Bulldog and the Hart family, the very relationship that had made Wembley so magical, curdled into bitterness. That embrace in the center of the ring, Diana caught weeping between her husband and her brother, had been one of the purest images the company ever produced. In the years that followed, that same family would be torn apart by divorce, by resentment, and by grief. Because the Hart family, the first family of Canadian wrestling, the clan that Davey had married into, was itself heading toward tragedy. In 1999, Bret and Diana's younger brother, Owen Hart, would fall to his death during a pay-per-view stunt gone horribly wrong, a loss that shattered the family and poisoned its relationship with the company forever. The warmth of that Wembley embrace, the brothers-in-law and the sister united under the lights, was a snapshot of a family at its happiest, taken just before the darkness came for all of them. Knowing everything that followed, it is almost painful to watch now. Everyone in that ring was smiling. None of them could see what was coming. He went to rehab. Vince McMahon, to his credit, paid for it, but it did not take. He got clean, then relapsed, then tried again, caught in the exhausting cycle that so many addicts know all too well. And here's the part that makes it almost unbearable. By 2002, it looked like Davey Boy Smith might actually make it. By many accounts, he had gotten off the hard drugs. He was training again. He was talking about a comeback, about getting his body and his life back together. After everything, there was a flicker of hope. Then in May of 2002, while on vacation in British Columbia with his girlfriend, Davey Boy Smith suffered a massive heart attack in his sleep. He died. He was 39 years old, and the coroner and those close to him pointed to the obvious culprits. Years of anabolic substance use, which places enormous strain on the heart. Years of painkiller abuse. The cumulative damage of a lifetime spent forcing his body to be bigger and stronger and more durable than nature had ever intended. The very things that had built the British Bulldog were the things that killed Davey Boy Smith. He never even reached 40, 10 years. That is all the time that passed between the greatest night of his life and his death. 10 years between the fireworks at Wembley and the heart attack in a bedroom in Canada. The hero of England, gone at 39, leaving behind children, including a son who would grow up to follow him into the very business that had consumed his father. And there is one more piece of this story. One final piece of darkness that Bret Hart carried with him for years. Bret Hart considered his match with Davey at SummerSlam 1992 to be, quite possibly, the greatest match of his entire career. The favorite match he ever had. He said he would not change that moment for anything. He had walked into Wembley with a broken down partner and produced a miracle, carrying a sick man to a classic, giving 80,000 people a night they would never forget. And when it was over, when he walked back through the curtain, drenched in sweat, having just accomplished one of the most difficult feats of his professional life, he expected his peers to be there. The other wrestlers, the men who understood exactly how hard what he had just done truly was. The locker room was empty. Everyone had already left. They had not even watched. There was no ovation, no acknowledgement, no pat on the back from the men who would have known better than anyone what he had pulled off. The boys, as wrestlers call each other, had packed their bags and headed out into the London night, off to the hotel bars and the after parties, without waiting to see how the main event of one of the biggest shows in company history had turned out. Bret Hart, having just wrestled what he believed was the greatest match of his life in front of one of the largest crowds in the history of the business, walked through the curtain expecting his brothers and found nothing but concrete and echoes, and he has talked about that emptiness in the years since, and the hurt in it is unmistakable even after all this time. Imagine pouring everything you have into a performance, taking a broken partner and dragging him bodily to greatness, doing the single hardest and most impressive thing you have ever done in your professional life, and then turning around to share it with your peers and finding that they had not even bothered to stick around. That silence, that absence, told its own story about the cold and lonely reality behind the glamour of professional wrestling. About how, even at the very top, even on the greatest night, a wrestler is ultimately alone with what the business takes out of him. The crowd goes home happy, the company counts the money, and the man who bled to make it all work stands in an empty room, wondering if anyone even saw. The fans saw fireworks, Bret saw an empty locker room, the fans saw a hero raising a championship. Behind the scenes, that hero was a dying man. The fans saw the top of the mountain, and underneath it, the ground was already giving way. That is the dark truth behind World Wrestling Federation SummerSlam 1992. Not a lie, exactly. Everything the fans felt that night was real. The joy was real, the drama was real, the greatness of that main event was absolutely real, and it deserves every bit of the praise it has received over the decades. It really may be the finest match in the history of SummerSlam, but greatness in professional wrestling has always come with a hidden invoice. And the men of that era paid it in full. They paid it with their hearts and their livers and their joints. They paid it with addiction and divorce and early graves. They paid it so that 78,000 people in Wembley Stadium and millions more at home could have one perfect summer night. That is the terrible bargain at the center of this whole business, and it was never more visible than on that night in London. The audience gets the magic, the performers get the bill, and for far too long, nobody was willing to talk honestly about what that bill actually was, because talking about it would have meant admitting that the supermen were mortal, that the invincible bodies were failing, that the industry was quietly consuming the very people who made it great. It was easier to sell the illusion, it was more profitable to sell the illusion, and so the illusion is what the fans got, right up until the obituaries started arriving, one after another, far too early for far too many. There's a version of this story that is nothing but darkness, and that version would not be fair either, because these men chose this life, most of them, with open eyes, and they loved it. They loved the roar of the crowd. They loved the craft. Davey Boy Smith, whatever his demons, gave the people of England a moment they will treasure forever. And by every account, there was a part of him that lived for exactly that. Bret Hart considers the night the crown jewel of his career, and he is proud of it, as he should be. The joy was not fake. The tragedy and the triumph lived side by side, tangled together, impossible to fully separate. That is what makes it haunt you. Davey Boy Smith gave the fans of England the greatest night of his life, and it cost him the rest of it. The Ultimate Warrior gave them a spectacle and left us at 54. Mr. Perfect, Earthquake, Kamala, and so many others from that golden poisoned era, gone far too soon. That is what makes the footage so haunting now. In 1992, the men walking through Wembley looked indestructible. They were larger than life, surrounded by music, flags, fireworks, and a crowd so loud that the whole night felt immortal. Nobody watching from the stands could see the years being taken off their lives. Nobody could see the injuries that would linger, the addictions that would worsen, or the funerals that would eventually replace reunions. The show was designed to make consequences invisible, and for one unforgettable night, it worked perfectly. Davey's victory captures that contradiction better than almost anything wrestling ever produced. He was exhausted, compromised, and carrying pressure that would have crushed most performers. Yet when the bell rang, he still had to become the hero everyone had paid to see. Bret Hart guided him through the match, but the crowd never saw the struggle underneath it. They saw the Bulldog survive, counter, and finally trap Bret for the 3 count. They saw a national celebration. They did not see the damage already accumulating behind the smile. That is the strange cruelty of watching wrestling history decades later. We know too much. We know which bodies broke down, which careers ended early, and which men never reached old age. The same knowledge that makes the match more tragic also makes the achievement feel even more extraordinary. They created something beautiful while living inside a system that often rewarded them for ignoring every warning their bodies gave them along the way. When you go back and watch that match today, and you should because it truly is a masterpiece, try to remember what it really was. Not just 2 athletes at the top of their game, but one desperate company gambling everything on foreign soil. One sick man being guided through a miracle by his own brother-in-law, and an entire generation of performers smiling for the cameras, unaware that so many of them were already running out of time. Watch the way the crowd moves, that vast sea of people rising and falling with every near fall. Watch Davey's face when the referee's hand hits the mat for the 3rd time and the fireworks go up, that pure, uncomplicated joy of a man who has just won the biggest match of his life in front of his own people. Then remember that he had less than 10 years left. Remember that he boarded the plane to that triumph without sleep and full of poison. Remember the empty locker room waiting on the other side of the curtain. Hold all of it in your mind at once, the beauty and the ruin, and you will understand something true about this strange and brutal art form that so many of us love in spite of everything it costs. Professional wrestling asks its performers to give the audience their bodies, not a metaphor, their actual bodies, their hearts and their spines and their years. Most of the men who wrestled at Wembley that night said yes to that bargain without ever fully reading the terms. And the bill, when it came due, was paid in funerals. The greatest match in SummerSlam history, and one of the saddest stories wrestling has ever told. If this look behind the curtain meant something to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we have many more of these hard-hitting wrestling documentaries on the way, the stories behind the stories, the truth behind the spectacle. Thank you for watching, and until next time.